Hi there, everybody. Welcome back to our Parenting Today lecture series. We are in week 5, lecture part number 3 here, talking about pregnancy among teenagers and adolescents in the United States. So research tells us that each year, almost 750,000 United States women between the ages of 15 to 19 become pregnant. 2/3 of all teen pregnancies occur among 18 to 19-year-olds. 2008 pregnancy rate, there was a decline. It was a record low, and that was a 42% decline from the peak rate, which occurred in the year 1990. Research tells us that the highest teen pregnancy rates are among African American and Latino teens. Non-Hispanic whites have the lowest birth rate. The decline in teenage pregnancy is primarily due to improved contraception use and increased proportions of teens choosing to delay sexual activity. And it's also important to remember that the United States teen pregnancy rate continues to be one of the highest in the developed world. So the rate here in the US is twice as high as the rates in Canada and Switzerland. Here is a geographical or graphical depiction here of teen pregnancy outcomes from the year 2006. And then we also have teen pregnancy rates by state. This particular graphic is from the year 2005. I'm talking about STDs, otherwise known as STIs, or sexually transmitted infections, sexually transmitted diseases. 13 to 24-year-olds made up about 17% of all people diagnosed with HIV/AIDS in the United States in the year 2008. So although 15 to 24-year-olds represent only 1/4 of the sexually active population, they account for nearly half of the 18.9 million new cases of sexually transmitted infections each year. So teens often really mistakenly believe that oral sex is safe sex. All 50 states and the District of Columbia allow minors to consent for sexually transmitted infection services without parental involvement. Talking now about parental role in sex education, 51% of teenagers, so that's 61% of females and 42% of males, had discussed readiness for sex with their parents. 50% of male teens had discussed condoms with parents, but only 35% had discussed other forms of contraception. 54% of female teens had discussed condoms, and 63% had discussed other forms of contraception with parents. And 50% of teens, that's 56% of females and 44% of males, had discussed STIs or sexually transmitted infections with parents. Talking a little bit more about research in regard to parental role in sex education, we know that 83% of teens are worried about their parents' reaction. So 80% of teens worry that their parents will think that they have had sex or going to have sex. 78% were too embarrassed to talk about it with their parents. And 77%, so that's 83% of females and 71% of males, don't know how to bring the subject up. So this is really useful information to keep in mind whether you're working with adolescents or parenting adolescents. So teens get information from peers, from schools, from the media, from the internet, and from health care professionals, as well as parents. So parents should provide information, reading materials, maybe commenting on news items, to really provide their children with information that parents feel is important for them to know. So whether that's information about health, information about the parents' own moral or religious views, it's something that it's important for parents to initiate conversation. That's what we can derive from the research. So parents should really be attuned to hesitancy or reluctance on the part of the teens. Ways that we can do this as parents is to use listening skills, stay calm, and don't assume that teens are sexually active just because they might not be wanting to talk with you about sex. We're talking about substance abuse, which is another big issue that can surface or become exacerbated during the teenage years. There are sex differences when it comes to substance use among teens. Late adolescent boys tend to use more substances than girls. There are ethnic differences. Native Americans tend to have higher rates of substance abuse, and Asian Americans, when compared to other cultural counterparts, tend to have lower rates. The most common substance that's used among teens is alcohol, and we do know that from research-based endeavors that alcohol increases the number of accidents and also increases high-risk sexual behavior among teens. So this right here is substance abuse in adolescence among 10th and 12th graders. We're looking at different substances here, specifically the substances of cigarettes, alcohol, marijuana, and cocaine. Myriad of problems that are associated with substance use. Substance use is associated with lower academic performance, dropout rates, unemployment, and having a child out of wedlock. Substance abuse is predictable based on early school performance when we look at the data or the research retrospectively, another really important fact. So early interventions in schools that focus on skill building rather than comparison to peers may help reduce school frustration that leads to substance abuse in later years. Shifting our focus, and we're talking about adolescence, I'm going to talk about school or adolescence in an academic setting. So in regard to the classroom, typically there's a dramatic change in class size, as well as a dramatic change in the relationships with teachers. And this typically occurs in the United States in middle school. In most middle schools, most middle public schools in the United States, children go from being with one teacher all day to having multiple teachers. So they lose that secure base of having that one consistent teacher presence. And you definitely want to remember that fact because there's going to be a question on the quiz about that. The classroom, as children get into the period of adolescence, requires a certain level of self-motivation. Kids tend to spend less time interacting with peers, and it's really the beginning of a competition among peers. So this right here is the Harvard Family Research Project. I encourage you to check it out if you have some extra time and if this is a topical area that interests you in regard to our Parenting Today course. This leads us to a very important question. Do parents matter in adolescent achievement? So what is the relationship between parent expectations and achievement when we look at the data, when we look at research and literature? The literature tells us that the further in school parents believed their adolescents would go, the higher the adolescent's academic achievement would be. Also, we know that the further in school parents believe their adolescents would go, the clearer the adolescent's perception of such expectations and the higher their own academic expectations. So the higher would be their own academic achievement. Also, too, the further in school parents believe their adolescents would go, the clearer the adolescent's perception of such expectations, the more time that they would be spending on homework, the higher the academic achievement. So the bottom line, the takeaway here is that parent expectations help children to believe that they will achieve, and it helps motivate them to behave in ways that ensure success. So again, do parents matter in adolescent achievement? When teens encounter frustration, parents can help with problem solving. They can act as advocates for their teens when necessary. The incremental theory of ability is defined as the practice and hard work can improve school performance regardless of ability. So you definitely want to put a circle or a star around this particular definition because you will see a quiz question about the definition of incremental theory of ability. You're remembering that that's the belief that practice and hard work can improve school performance regardless of ability. Talk about entering the workforce. Teens may begin to work for the first time during this particular life stage of adolescence. Data tells us that 1 in 4 high school students work, so that's roughly 3 million high school students working in the United States, and 1% of high school students work full-time. There are a myriad of benefits that are associated with working outside of the home during adolescence. It can be an escape from frustrations or a dysfunction, either at school or at home. It may be a source of self-esteem for children. Kids can actually acquire job skills that they can use later in life. It can, of course, be a source of extra money, and it can motivate some to work harder in school. Other problems, looking conversely now at the other side, there are problems that are associated with working during adolescence. Students that work more than 15 hours a week statistically have lower grades than their counterparts who don't work or work less than 15 hours a week. Also, working more than 15 hours a week is associated with smoking, drinking alcohol, as well as other substance or drug use. So really, parents are an important scaffold here. They can help monitor and help teens balance the work, school, and social demands as well. Now we're going to shift our focus a bit and talk about emotional development and adolescence. So talk about the work of G. Stanley Hall. We know that adolescence is inevitably a time of stress and conflict. So is this true? What do you guys think? Parents can be a moderator of stress. So we know that hormones by themselves don't create adolescent turmoil. Hormones take over in the presence of stress from parents or the living environment and can lead to adjustment problems. So when stress is low or when teens are being showed how they can regulate or moderate that stress effectively, hormones don't always have a great impact. So there's characteristics of emotions in teens. Emotions can become more negative in early teens, but the majority of emotions are positive. So this information is coming to us from data, research, and it's sort of contradicting a lot of what we hear about in mass media or sometimes either from friends that maybe have teenagers, parents of teenagers are complaining about teens. So most of the negativity is centered mostly around school. Stress in the home and at school can spill over into another environment, and teens overall require a strong social support to be able to cope with emotions. Later on, teens tend to develop a more positive outlook, have less depression than in the earlier teen years. Which leads us to a very important discussion of mental illness. We want to remember that 50% of psychiatric illness begins in adolescence or early adulthood. So it's a really important time to be aware of. This is when somebody can have their first psychotic episode or first experience with depression or a lifelong struggle or with mental illness. Depression and anxiety are the most common among teens. And going back to a study from the year 2013, 10.7% of teens between 12 and 17 had major depressive disorder. So that's 2.6 million teens altogether here in the United States. 33% of girls reported having suicidal thoughts, 18% of boys reported having those suicidal thoughts, and 13% of girls actually made a suicide attempt as compared with 6% of boys that made a suicide attempt. So this right here is a graphic pictorial display here of a 12-month prevalence of major depressive episodes among adolescents in the United States, taken from the year 2013 here. Managing teen emotions. So we're going to end this particular part of the lecture series and we will begin our discussion on part 4, talking about how to manage teen emotions. So I look forward to seeing you again.